You finally escaped that monster when... It all begins on one sunny morning in just a normal Plains village. And all was good there, as the villagers were working hard, farming in their fields, baking bread, and forging armor, all while the mighty Iron Golem was patrolling the streets, keeping all of the villagers safe from the dangers of the world. And so everything seemed to be normal. However, just as the sun began to rise on that fateful day, all the villagers suddenly gained sight of a being off in the distance. It was something that none of them had seen in centuries. It was a Steve. And so all the villagers were quite excited, as any Steve was like a god to them. However, as all the villagers stood there, waiting in anticipation, that Steve just stood there, frozen in place. Now, this concerned the villagers, as they began to think that the Steve was stuck on something, and he needed their help, as never before had he just stood somewhere for no reason. And thus, the brave Iron Golem decided to go and investigate, and he was ready to help that Steve if needed. And so it only took that Golem an hour when he finally reached the Steve. But still, even then, with an Iron Golem walking towards him, that Steve didn't move. That was weird. But regardless, the Iron Golem kept on moving closer and closer and closer to that Steve, until just when he was about to touch him, the ground collapsed. And so instantly, the Iron Golem began to fall down to the ground. Oh no, this was it. He was going to die now, and so he closed his eyes, bracing for it. But luckily, he survived. Now, he did sustain rather serious damage, but that didn't matter to him, as he needed to make sure that that Steve was safe. And so he began to look around to see where he was. But he couldn't see him. However, it was then, while looking around for the Steve, that Golem realized something. That being that this pit that he had fallen into was not natural, as it was cut so perfectly. And so it was man-made. However, by the time that he realized that, it was too late, as from the shadows came several villagers, and before the Iron Golem could defend himself, they all began to throw orange potions at him. And well, because of that, his world began to spin, and he felt sick, and then it all went dark. Several days passed when he finally began to regain consciousness. But when that happened, he quickly realized that he was no longer in that pit, nor was he back in the village. No, instead, he was in an illager mansion. Oh no, this was bad, very bad, and there was no way that he could escape, as he was tied down in a cage. And so he was doomed. But still, despite that, the Iron Golem was determined to free himself and return to his village. And so for that reason, he began to pull as hard as he possibly could on those chains in an attempt to break them. And he also began to scream out for help, thinking that a villager might be nearby and would be able to help him. However, both of those attempts to regain his freedom failed completely, and in fact, they only harmed him, as due to all that sound that he was creating, several evokers were lured into that room. And well, now that they knew that the Iron Golem was awake, they began to experiment on him. And so, over the next few years, those illagers did anything that they could think of with that Golem, be it submerging him in powdered snow, or covering him in rotten flesh, or lighting him on fire, as well as so many other things, all whilst casting millions of spells upon him. Now, the reason that those evokers were doing all that was because they were planning to use that Golem to create a monster unlike anything that the world had ever seen, and they were hoping that this monster would allow them to rule the world. And they were very close to being able to do that, as all their experiments had resulted in that golem gaining many powers, from invincibility to teleportation. And they were just about to gain control of the golem's mind and release all those powers in full potential to that golem when they heard it. Screams from evokers coming from downstairs. That wasn't right, and so all the evokers, terrified with what was going on, stopped their work on the golem, and they all ran out of that room to see what was happening. And well, they would never return, as the mansion was then set on fire, which quickly killed all of the villagers. Now, that golem could see a strange red beast running away from that mansion, and so he assumed that he had something to do with the screams. But he couldn't quite tell what that being was. And well, he wasn't going to, as just seconds later, that fire had spread to his room, engulfing him and his cage in flames. This was it, as he was tied down to that cage, and so he couldn't escape, and thus he believed that he was going to burn to death. However, due to all of those experiments, he was fire resistant, and so he wasn't taking any damage. But that didn't mean that he was free from suffering, as over the next 12 hours, that golem was in excruciating pain, as his skin began to burn and boil. And worse than that, there was nothing that he could do to end that pain. However, very luckily, after enduring all that suffering, a storm began to develop over that mansion. And so, it didn't take too long before it began to rain. And with that, the fire was put out. Also, very luckily, due to all that rain, the cage that he was tied to finally broke, as all that excess water was enough to cause the metallic chains to loosen, and thus the Iron Golem was able to drop out of it. And so he was free at last. But still, he was just so traumatized by all that he had just gone through that he just stood there, trying to take it in. However, as he did that, a bolt of lightning suddenly struck him. And so, due to that, all the rotten flesh that he was surrounded with at the time that the illagers had abandoned him was suddenly fused into his crumbling outer layers. And he also gained a sudden burst of energy. But it was all too much, as that energy caused the wiring within him to overclock, and thus he died. However, just a few seconds later, his dead body was struck by a second bolt of lightning, and this time, that bolt of lightning energized him and allowed him to come back to life. And so, he was now the Undead Golem. And so, with that, he ran out of the charred remains of that mansion, and then he made his way to a river. And as he stood there on that riverbed, watching the water flow, he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever, as he was just done protecting the villagers and looking out for thieves. No, instead, he now wanted revenge upon them. As if it wasn't for the villagers using him as a mere disposable protector, he never would have gone up that hill. And if it wasn't for that Steve, he never would have fallen into that pit and gone through all that immense suffering with the illagers. And yet, at the same time, he wasn't really angry at the illagers, as they were just naturally evil. And so, for that reason, he was just completely outraged at the villagers and the players who used him while acting like they were the moral and righteous ones. They were the liars. And so, he wanted them all to suffer. That was his goal in this new life. And so, with that, he then began to travel the world, going to villages in all biomes, asking the villagers where any Steves were. Now, normally, none of the villagers had any idea where a Steve was, as after all, no Steve had visited their village in tens of thousands of years. And so, still fueled with anger, the Undead Golem would just kill all of the villagers. Now, the regular golems within those villages would try to save the villagers, but really, they were just too weak to fight back against the Undead Golem, as after all, the Undead Golem had the strength of all the zombies that his body had the flesh of combined. Not to mention the countless spells of strength and power that the evil villagers had casted upon him. And so, for that reason, he was able to kill any villager, or any golem in fact, in just one hit. And thus it would be, over the next few years, that the Undead Golem travelled to spruce villages, and plains villages, and desert villages, and snowy villages, and savannah villages, all so that he could kill hundreds of thousands of villagers, and occasionally, even a Steve. As 1 in 1,000 villages, or so, would have a villager that would know of the location of a Steve, as sometimes one would visit them. And so, when that happened, the Undead Golem would take that villager and would force them to show him where that Steve was. But, once the Undead Golem had sights on the Steve, well, that villager wasn't spared, as he was killed on the spot. And then, the Undead Golem would begin to chase the Steve. Now, those Steves, being faced with the Undead Golem, would do one of 3 things. Either they would freeze in fear, would try to run away, or try to fight back. However, it didn't matter which of the 3 the Steve attempted to do, as the Undead Golem would just kill them on the spot, or would teleport over to them and then kill them, or would just win the battle quite easily against them. As after all, due to all those experiments, the Undead Golem had invincibility against fire, ice, the subscribe button, and any sword too. And so, no attacks could injure the Undead Golem that badly. And he did have super strength, and thus killing the mighty Steve wasn't too difficult. But what he would do next was just diabolical, as the Undead Golem, after killing a Steve, would go up to its dead body, where he would then rip out its head, keeping it as a memento. It was a gruesome sight to behold, but no one was going to stop him. And so, over the next few decades, the Undead Golem was able to collect thousands of Steve heads, and was able to kill millions of villagers. And so, life was good for him, as he was finally getting his revenge. However, despite that, the Undead Golem still wanted something, as he wanted a place to call home. And so, for that reason, he temporarily stopped hunting and began to look for a home. And thus, over the next few months, he swam through oceans, climbed giant trees, ran across scorching deserts, and jumped over their deadly dripstone caves, all until he eventually found the perfect place, as he had found a swamp. And he loved it there, as it reminded him of the sad, gloomy reality that life was. But not only that, he also loved the green water and the brown leaves, and the fact that all other beings stayed away from the swamps. And so, this swamp was going to be his own private oasis. And so, happy with his discovery, the Undead Golem then began to place down iron blocks, as those were his favourite blocks, all across the land, almost in the pattern of a path. And then he began to place the Steve heads onto those iron blocks. However, as the Undead Golem had been carrying those heads for several years, most of them had rotted and had become, well, zombified skeletal heads. But still, he just loved to see the suffering skulls of his enemies at all times. And so, after placing all of those skulls throughout the swamp, he then began to build a small hut in the center of all those paths, and he decorated it before finally casting a spell onto his home. A spell that would result in him, the Undead Golem, being teleported back to this hut the moment that any one of his Steve heads was moved, even if he was dead once again. As he really just did not want anyone or anything touching his prized possessions. And so, once that spell was casted, his new home was complete, and the Undead Golem could begin to live in it. And so, over the next few weeks, the Undead Golem spent his days relaxing in the swamp water, staring at the dead player skulls, plotting his next attack, and just taking in the scenery of the beautiful swamps. It was a very nice life for him. But after relaxing in his new home for those weeks, the Undead Golem was fully recharged and was ready to get back on his mission of revenge. And so he left his beloved home and began to travel the world once again, ready to collect more skulls from those evil and hypocritical players. And luckily, as it was nearing Halloween, the villagers were starting to put up jack-o'-lanterns and pumpkins and various other decorations, which meant that they were far easier to spot. But, more importantly, for the Undead Golem, the players also began to put up Halloween decorations. However, they were far more extravagant, as they were putting up giant black and orange beacons, as well as more jack-o'-lanterns than any other village. And while it might have looked nice for the players, it was actually a self-inflicted trap that would lead to their demise. As, due to all that light that they were emitting, the Undead Golem was able to find them far easier than he had ever before in the past. In fact, it was so easy to find them now that he didn't even need to go into a village. And so, for that reason, in just that month leading up to Halloween, the Undead Golem was able to collect more skulls of the players than he had ever before. And on the night of Halloween, when even more decorations were put up, the Undead Golem had access to the locations of more Steves than he had ever seen. Yes, this was it. This was the moment when he was going to get his revenge on as most Steves that he possibly could. However, before he was able to kill just one Steve on that night, he was suddenly teleported back to his swamp. Because, as it turns out, a villager had somehow made its way into the swamp and had found all these Steve heads placed on those iron blocks. But they weren't horrified enough by it, and so they foolishly decided not to run, but instead to touch one of the heads. And well, due to that, the Undead Golem was brought to them, and once he realized what was going on, he was fueled with rage and anger, and so he charged at that villager. Now, that villager was fast, and so he was able to get into a boat and begin rowing away before the Undead Golem was able to hit him. But he wasn't fast enough, as the Undead Golem was able to teleport over to him and kill him in just one hit. But once he killed that villager, he looked up and realized something. There was a set of artificial lights far away on the other side of his swamp. he could see their reflection. Hold on, he had never seen that before, and so he began to travel to those lights, and well, what he ended up seeing shocked him, as he saw that a group of thieves were here in his swamp, and they were ruining his land, as they had built a giant, ugly building. This was not okay for the Undead Golem, as no being was meant to build here, as this was his land, and only his land. And so, fueled with rage, the Undead Golem let out a curse onto those thieves, unlike anything that had ever been seen on the surface of the entire world. And so, to find out what happened next, you'll need to watch this video.